She wasn't running away. She wasn't chasing anyone. She just said yes to a weekend by a lake, and without knowing it, to a version of herself she had long forgotten. This isn't a story about betrayal. It's a story about awakening, about what happens when someone finally asks, "Are you happy?" and you don't know how to answer. I never imagined I'd be the kind of woman who needed more. At 62, I thought I had settled into the life I'd earned. A modest home, a husband who still remembered how I took my tea, a garden that bloomed every spring without fail. I had structure, predictability, a rhythm I knew by heart. And yet, something in me had gone quiet, not broken, not grieving, just muted. My days were full, but I often found myself staring out the kitchen window for longer than I meant to, watching the same birds return to the same branches, listening to silence that didn't feel peaceful, just familiar. So when Martin, my husband of over 3 decades, came home one Thursday evening and casually said, "Thomas invited you up to his lake house this weekend," I blinked. "Us?" I asked, rinsing a glass in the sink. Martin shook his head. "No, just you. I've got work piling up. But he thought you might like some quiet," said, and I quote, "Evelyn always seems so composed." I let the warm water run over my hands, eyes fixed on the bubbles disappearing down the drain. Composed. It was a strange word to hear myself described as accurate, maybe, but distant. Like a painting hung neatly on a wall, admired, but never touched. Why would Thomas invite me? I asked, not out of suspicion, just confusion. Martin only shrugged. Said you might enjoy a break. I think he meant it kindly. Maybe he did. And maybe that was the first time in a long while I felt something flutter inside me. Not desire, not rebellion, just curiosity about the person I'd become. That Friday, I packed a simple overnight bag, a couple of paperbacks, a cozy sweater, nothing extravagant, just enough to feel like I'd given it a little thought. The drive north was peaceful. Pine trees pressed close to the narrow road, like old friends. The sun was just beginning to fall behind the hills when I caught my first glimpse of the lake. It shimmered, not in a dramatic postcard kind of way, but gently, like it had been waiting for me. The house was beautiful in a quiet sort of way. Cedar planks, a wide porch wrapped around the front like open arms. I pulled into the gravel drive just as the sky turned a soft amber. Thomas was waiting. He wasn't a particularly striking man, not in the way younger women might turn their heads, but there was something grounded about him. The way he stood with his hands in his pockets, the way his smile didn't try too hard. "Evelyn," he said, walking toward me. "I'm really glad you came." He said my name like it meant something, like he'd been practicing it quietly just in case. I stepped out of the car, suddenly aware of the way the light touched the edges of my face, the laugh lines I used to be proud of. "Thank you for inviting me," I said. Thomas took my bag, even though I protested. "You could use a little stillness," he said. "No schedules. No expectations. Just the lake and maybe a glass of wine." There was nothing suggestive in his tone, just presence. And somehow, that felt more intimate than anything I'd known in years. That evening, we sat on the porch as the sun slipped behind the trees. The lanterns he'd strung along the railing cast a soft, golden glow over everything. The air smelled of cedar and distant firewood. Somewhere, a loon called out across the water. We spoke of small things, our children, our routines, the quiet ache of growing older. At one point, I said, Sometimes I feel like I've done all the things I was supposed to do, and now I've become invisible in my own life. Thomas was quiet, thoughtful. You don't seem invisible to me, he said gently. And I don't know why, but that stayed with me. Not as a compliment, but as a reminder. A reminder that maybe, just maybe, there was still more to discover about myself. The sun was slipping behind the trees as I followed Thomas up the porch steps. He moved easily, without the stiffness men sometimes carry after a certain age. Not hurried, not showing off, just sure. The house itself felt like something from an old novel. Cedar walls, wide planked floors, windows that looked out over the water like a pair of quiet, open eyes. It didn't feel like a stranger's home. It felt like a place that remembered people. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and aged wood. There were shelves filled with books, some turned sideways, spines softened with use. A record player in the corner. A kettle already warming on the stove. This way, Thomas said, leading me down a short hallway. He opened a door to a guest room facing the lake. I hope this is all right. It was more than all right. It was simple and clean. A bed with a quilt folded neatly at the foot. A lamp with a soft amber bulb. And the windows, tall and unashamed, framing the water like a painting in constant motion. I've left the windows open, he said. You'll sleep with the sound of the lake. I smiled. That sounds perfect. Later that evening, we sat on the porch, a quiet meal between us, grilled trout with lemon and herbs, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of something white and gently floral. Thomas poured slowly, the wine catching the light like glass dipped in gold. We didn't rush conversation. There was no need to fill the silence. Instead, we let it breathe. Let it stretch out like the lake before us. He asked me about my garden, about what I'd been reading. I told him about my children, both grown, both living too far away for comfort. He spoke of his granddaughter in Oregon, of the long drives he used to take with his late wife before the silence between them became too familiar. And somewhere between the second glass of wine and the gentle call of a loon across the lake, I found myself saying, almost without thinking, it's strange how invisible you can feel, like you fulfilled your role, and now you're meant to fade quietly into the backdrop. I hadn't meant to say it aloud. I hadn't even meant to admit it to myself. But Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't offer platitudes. Instead, he tilted his head, his eyes steady on mine, and said, softly, you don't strike me as the fading kind. Something in me went very still. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, like he meant them, like he saw something I hadn't dared to see in myself for years. When I finally settled into bed, the sheets were crisp and cool, and the night air drifted in like a whispered lullaby. I lay awake, not from discomfort, but from awareness of the moonlight moving across the floor, of the slow creak of wood as the house settled, of how long it had been since I'd felt quietly awake. There was no moment I could point to and say, that's when everything changed. But something had shifted, subtle, gentle, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for far too long. I woke to the scent of coffee and something slightly smoky, bacon, maybe, and the sound of soft jazz humming faintly from another room. For a moment, I forgot where I was.
The bed.
The light. The way the morning air moved through the open window. It felt like waking inside a memory that wasn't mine, but somehow knew me anyway. I wrapped myself in a cardigan and padded barefoot to the kitchen. Thomas stood at the stove, dressed in jeans and a navy sweater, humming along to the music with a spatula in hand. You're up, he said, offering a warm smile. I made too much breakfast, but I was hoping you'd save me for myself. He handed me a mug of coffee before I could even ask. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't flirtatious. It was familiar, like we'd done this 100 quiet mornings before. After breakfast, he gestured toward the lake. What do you think about a canoe ride? The water's like glass this time of morning. I hesitated, not out of reluctance, but out of surprise at the thrill that passed through me. I'd love that, I said. We moved across the lake slowly, the canoe gliding like a breath across the still surface. The oars barely rippled the water. Every sound felt amplified. A bird's call, the splash of a fish, the rhythmic drip of water off wood. The world felt paused, like we were the last two people left awake in it. I let my fingers drift through the lake as we floated. The water was shockingly cold, but grounding, real in a way most things in my life hadn't felt in a long time. Then, almost without thinking, I asked, "Did you ever want something different?" Thomas paused mid-stroke, his paddle stilled in the water. He didn't look at me right away, just stared out across the mirrored surface of the lake, where the trees cast soft reflections like secrets, too proud to whisper. "Different than what?" he asked. I shrugged. "Life, I suppose. The version we ended up with." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I used to." He shifted in his seat. "I think I stopped asking, stopped expecting. But lately," he trailed off, then said quietly, "Lately I've started wondering again." We didn't speak after that. There was nothing to add. His words drifted between us like the morning mist, weightless and yet impossible to ignore. Later, when we pulled the canoe ashore, he offered me his hand without a word. I took it, not because I needed help, but because I wanted to know what it felt like to be offered something gently. And maybe that was the most unexpected part of it all. Not the words we said, but how easily we let the silence speak for us. That day, something inside me opened. It didn't burst. It unfolded, softly, like petals long kept closed. And though I didn't have a name for what was growing between us, I knew this much. It wasn't about escape. It wasn't even about him. It was about me, remembering that I still existed beneath all the titles I'd carried. Wife, mother, caregiver, and that maybe, just maybe, I still had more than routine left in me. The dock was still damp from the morning mist, and the lake shimmered like brushed silver under a pale sun. Thomas and I hadn't spoken much since the canoe ride. Not out of awkwardness, more like a shared agreement that silence was sacred here. I sat cross-legged near the edge, my bare feet dangling just above the water. The planks beneath me were warm from the rising sun, and somewhere behind us, wind chimes sang a lazy tune. When he returned from the house, he held something small in his hand. "I brought this," he said, offering it to me like a peace offering, though no piece had been disturbed. It was a sketch pad, well worn, with a few pencil stubs tucked neatly into its spine. I looked up at him, startled. "For me?" He nodded, almost shyly. "I wasn't sure if you still, but I had a feeling. I hadn't drawn in over 20 years. Once I used to lose entire afternoons to it, shading, shaping, letting time blur around the curves of charcoal and light. But like so many things, it had been set aside, quietly, when life demanded something more practical of me. I don't even know if I remember how I murmured. "You don't have to," Thomas said gently. "You just start." So I started, clumsily at first, my hand rusty, my lines too cautious. But something in my muscles remembered the rhythm. And soon, I was sketching the edge of the lake, the way the pine trees bent slightly inward, the shimmering arc of light on the water. Next to me, Thomas had taken out his own pad. He didn't talk. He didn't correct. He simply sketched and let me sketch beside him. No critique, no comparison, just quiet company. An hour passed, maybe two. At some point, I paused, not because I was finished, but because I realized I hadn't thought about anything else since I'd begun. Not Martin, not my to-do lists, not who I needed to check on or call or feed or reassure. Just this, my hand, the paper, and the hush of a world that, for once, asked nothing of me but to be. When I finally looked over, Thomas was studying me, not my sketch, but me. What? I asked, self-conscious. He smiled. You looked peaceful. I think I forgot what that felt like. He didn't say anything, just nodded and returned his gaze to the water. And somehow, that small moment, that wordless recognition, felt more intimate than anything either of us could have spoken aloud. That afternoon, we sat on the porch with lemonade and sun-warmed silence. There was no need to entertain one another, no pressure to perform or explain, just two people with shared stillness and paper-smudged fingertips. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet sort of fullness, not from accomplishment, but from presence. And as the sun dipped low once more, casting golden light across the dock where our pencils had danced all morning, I realized something unexpected. I hadn't been seeking permission to feel more alive, but maybe I'd needed it anyway. And Thomas, without knowing it, had offered it. Not in words, but in the gentle gift of space. That evening, the sun sank slower, like it, too, wanted to linger. We sat beside a fire pit Thomas had built years ago, a simple circle of stones with logs placed just so, neither rustic nor polished, but something in between like him. The flames crackled low and steady. He handed me a blanket without asking if I was cold. I accepted it without needing to explain why I suddenly felt fragile. There was something different in the air that night. Not tense, not even romantic, just charged. Like we were standing at the edge of something neither of us had named. We talked about the ordinary first. Our children, his granddaughter's latest piano recital, the way Martin always left half-finished mugs of tea around the house, as if each one held some forgotten thought. And then, out of nowhere, Thomas's voice dropped, low, unhurried, but deliberate. Evelyn, he said, not looking at me, you don't have to answer this, but are you happy? It wasn't the kind of question people ask at dinner parties. It wasn't polite. It wasn't casual. It was true. And in that moment, it felt like the most intimate thing anyone had asked me in years. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because the question itself unwrapped something inside me, something tender, something buried under calendars and casseroles and years of being everything for everyone else. Finally, I said the only honest thing I could. I don't know. Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't rush in with solutions or reassurances. He simply nodded, like he understood. Not just the words, but the quiet ache behind them. I stared into the fire, listening to it pop and settle like an old house finding its posture for the night. I used to think I said softly. I used to think that if you did everything right, stayed kind, stayed loyal, stayed useful, happiness would eventually arrive. Like a letter you forgot you sent to yourself. I smiled, but there was no humor in it. I'm just not sure it ever came. Thomas finally looked at me then, not sharply, not with pity, just clearly. I think a lot of people confuse contentment with happiness, he said. They stop asking the question because the answer scares them. I breathed in through my nose, steady and slow. He was right, and maybe that scared me most of all.
We didn't speak for a while after that.
The silence was full, not empty. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders and closed my eyes for just a moment. And in the warmth of the firelight and the sound of the lake breathing softly in the dark, I felt something unfamiliar. Not desire, not sadness, but the quiet beginning of permission. Permission to ask different questions, to want something more, to admit I had been surviving a version of my life, not entirely living it. When I finally said goodnight and climbed the stairs to the guest room, I paused at the window. The lake was still, the sky painted in deep indigo, and my reflection in the glass. It didn't look tired. It didn't look lost. It looked aware, not of Thomas, not of what might or might not happen, but of myself, and how long it had been since I'd looked this closely at her. No birdsong, no jarring alarm, just the hush of a quiet house and the low murmur of wind pressing against the window panes. I wrapped myself in a blanket and followed the smell of coffee. Thomas was already at the kitchen table, a newspaper folded neatly in front of him, his reading glasses slipping low on his nose. He looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't ask for anything, just offered something small and steady. "Sleep all right?" he asked, handing me a mug without waiting for my answer. I nodded. "Your guest bed might be conspiring to keep me here." He laughed, warm and real. "I'll have to speak to it about boundaries." We sat across from each other, the lake just visible through the window behind him. The steam from our coffee curled upward like some quiet offering, and for a moment, the only sounds were the creak of chairs and the occasional turning of a page. I don't know what made me speak. Maybe it was the safety of the light. Maybe it was the quiet I no longer feared. But suddenly, I found myself saying, "I'm not used to this." Thomas looked up, waiting. To what? I hesitated then. Being seen? He didn't fill the silence. He didn't smooth it over. At home, people always needed things from me. Groceries, appointments, answers. But no one had asked how I was. Not really. Not in years. And I suppose I'd stopped asking myself too. Thomas set his coffee down gently. His voice was low, but clear. "Well, I see you, Evelyn. Every day you've been here, I've seen you." The words landed like a quiet weight in my chest. Not heavy in a painful way, but solid. Grounding. And something behind my ribs shifted. He stood and crossed the room, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder. Not possessive. Not performative. Just present. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "But if there's anything you do want to say, I'm here." It was so simple, but it was everything. I didn't cry, but something cracked open all the same. After breakfast, we went for a walk along the pine-covered trail behind the house. The ground was soft beneath our feet, blanketed in years of fallen needles. The sun filtered through the trees like thin strands of gold. It felt like we were walking through time, past versions of ourselves brushing against our shoulders like ghosts. "I think," I said slowly, "I've spent most of my life making sure everyone else was okay. My children, my husband, my parents, everyone. And now that there's finally space to think about what I want, I feel selfish." Thomas stopped walking. He turned to me, hands in his pockets, his eyes steady. "Wanting more for yourself isn't selfish," he said. "It's brave." He didn't try to dress it up, didn't whisper it like a secret. He just said it, like it was the most natural truth in the world. And somehow, that truth settled deeper in me than I expected. Not because I hadn't heard something like it before, but because this time I believed it. Evening fell like a sigh. After our walk through the woods, the world seemed quieter, as if it, too, was exhaling something it had held in too long. We made dinner together. It wasn't anything remarkable: grilled vegetables, warm bread, a simple salad. But there was something soothing in the domesticity of it. The way our elbows brushed when we reached for the same bowl. The way we laughed over slicing onions too thick or pouring too much dressing. There was no performance. No flirtation masked as courtesy. Just two people sharing space, sharing rhythm. And after we cleared the dishes and turned down the kitchen lights, Thomas pulled something from a cabinet in the corner of the living room. A record player. Old. Loved. The kind that hummed before it sang. He placed a vinyl on the turntable, and within seconds, soft jazz filled the room. Something slow. Something velvet. He turned to me with a quiet smile. "Do you dance?" I blinked. "I haven't in years. At least not without a glass of wine first," I added, half laughing. He raised an eyebrow. "Good thing we've already had one." He held out his hand, and just like that I said yes. There was only a beat of hesitation, not because I was unsure, but because I hadn't been held gently, respectfully in so long. I wasn't sure I'd remember how. He didn't pull me close. He let me come to him. One hand rested lightly at my waist, the other holding mine just firmly enough to remind me I was still here, still allowed to take up space. We moved slowly, swaying. No choreography. No plan, just presence. And as the music curled around us, I felt myself soften, not into him, but into me. At some point, without thinking, I rested my head on his shoulder. He was warm, steady, and I realized I didn't feel nervous. I didn't feel on edge. I felt wanted, not for what I could give, not for what I could fix or arrange or sacrifice, but simply for existing. And when the song ended, he didn't step away. He looked down at me, his voice just above a whisper. "I'm not trying to complicate anything," he said. "I just want to be honest. I've enjoyed every moment with you, and not just because you're good company." I looked up at him. Our faces were inches apart. My heart didn't race from fear or adrenaline. It beat with something quieter, more certain. "I know," I said, "and I feel the same." We didn't kiss. Not then. But something passed between us. Something deeper than touch. Something that hummed just beneath the surface. Warm, restrained, and unmistakably real. Later, in the guest room, I stood in front of the mirror brushing my hair. There was a softness in my reflection I hadn't seen in years. Not youth, not glamour, but presence. I thought of Martin not with guilt, but with clarity. Our marriage had been steady, loyal, predictable. But this feeling of being fully awake in someone's presence, that had been missing for a very long time. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to wonder what it meant to be truly seen, truly felt, without needing to earn it. The final morning arrived beneath a soft, gray sky. Rain tapped gently against the roof, slow and steady, like a farewell that wasn't ready to say itself out loud. I didn't wake to an alarm. I woke to the feeling of not wanting to leave. Not because something had happened, but because something had awakened, and I wasn't ready to tuck it away again. Downstairs, Thomas stood at the stove, humming something familiar. He was in a flannel shirt, barefoot, sleeves pushed to his elbows. There was butter sizzling in the pan, rosemary on the counter, and the smell of something warm already in the air. He glanced over his shoulder when I walked in. "I figured I'd make breakfast one last time," he said. "Though I was secretly hoping you might forget to leave." I smiled, holding his gaze just a little longer than usual. I didn't forget, I said. I just haven't decided yet. We sat at the table, coffee between us. We didn't talk about the drive home, or work, or what would happen next. The space between us was filled, but not with questions, with something more fragile, more delicate, understanding. After breakfast, while he washed the dishes and I dried them, I found myself glancing at the living room window. Rain streaked down the glass, and beyond it, the lake blurred like memory. Thomas stepped beside me, close but not touching. "I've been thinking," he said, voice quiet. I turned slightly. "About what?" He didn't look away. "About how sometimes we don't realize what we've been missing until it stands right in front of us." There was no performance in his voice, no expectation, just truth, laid bare and offered gently. "Evelyn," he continued, "I didn't bring you here with a plan. But whatever this is between us, it's real to me." I stepped closer, not out of impulse, but clarity. I placed my hand lightly on his chest. His heart beat beneath my fingers, steady, present, human. "It's real to me too," I said. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, and something in his face softened. "I don't know what happens next," I whispered. "I'm not running from anything, but I think I've been asleep for a long time. And this weekend it woke something up in me." Thomas gently took my hand in his. "You don't have to figure out today," he said, "but you do deserve to feel alive again. Not just for a weekend." When we finally kissed, it wasn't urgent or dramatic. It was slow, intentional, a quiet unfolding of something neither of us had expected, but both of us had clearly felt. There was no confusion,
No guilt.
just warmth, and the ache of something true being allowed to breathe. Later, he helped me pack. We folded clothes slowly, shared glances that held more than words could. Before I stepped outside, Thomas walked me to the car and reached into his pocket. "This is a little silly," he said, handing me a small, folded piece of paper. I opened it.
It was a sketch.
Me, sitting on the dock, sketchpad in my lap, head tilted slightly toward the lake. "You drew this?" I asked. He nodded. "I wanted to remember you exactly like that. Unaware, peaceful, yourself." I felt tears rise, but I didn't let them fall. Instead, I hugged him, fully, like someone saying goodbye not just to a place, but to who they were before they arrived. The drive home was quiet, but I wasn't. I wasn't conflicted. I wasn't confused. I was full. Something inside me had returned. Something I hadn't even realized had gone missing. Back in my kitchen, I placed the sketch on the fridge. I made tea. I stood at the window, and I let the wind stir the trees in my backyard. I thought about what it means to be seen, not as a wife, not as a caretaker, not as a woman doing everything right, but as Evelyn, still curious,
Still feeling.
still alive. Maybe the most surprising part wasn't what happened that weekend, but how it made me remember who I am. And that memory I will never let go of. Pushpin disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction inspired by emotional themes of self-discovery and human connection. It does not promote or encourage infidelity, nor does it reflect the real-life actions or choices of any individuals. Our intention is to explore the complexity of emotional experiences through storytelling that inspires reflection, empathy, and healing. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten in your own life, know that you are not alone. Thank you for watching.